him in checks a lot in life. And he said his son started that job really young. And he said he was griping at somebody when he was driving in the car. And then when he got done, he was really quiet. And then his son, who was like 7 or 6, and chirped in from the back row and said, "That was really an encouraging sermon, Pastor." And he said he has kept doing that his whole life. He's 37 now, apparently. So anyway, let's read Daniel chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. And we're just going to work our way through this chapter.
Shouldn't you have been on that prayer list?
Surgery was me.
It's tomorrow. I didn't see that on there.
That's okay. That's all right.
What kind of surgery you having?
Anyway, we need to pray for Janet.
Shoulder.
Already having one of those.
Okay, let's read Daniel 4, 1 through 3. You're distracting me.
Sorry.
Yes, you should be.
I got it.
Okay, thank
Mine
you.
starts out, Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a tree.
It does not.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, mine does too. It doesn't really.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah, well,
Okay. That's why mine is inspired and yours is not. You have to go a little deeper to get into the trees.
I'll continue.
Okay, keep going.
To the peoples, nations, and men of every language who live in all the world, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation.
Okay, so what is different about the way that this chapter opens up?
It's Nebuchadnezzar speaking.
Nebuchadnezzar is writing.
He's in the lap.
Yeah, and what does he say specifically? He used, and this is what does he say about this story? What does he say specifically in here?
Miraculous signs, wonders, and Most High God has performed for me.
For me, he has had an interaction with God. Okay, and so, and then how does
And this is a departure from speaking of God as if he's one
Yes.
of many.
Yes, very much. So we see this progression, okay, so to speak here, and it's important to recognize that declaration is personal. And then the things that he says about God. What does he say about God?
How great are his signs, mighty his wonders.
Everlasting.
Okay, and we're gonna, that's really important that's how he starts out, okay? And then, look, he's gonna narrate his story for us, so let's read 4 through 9.
I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and flourishing in my palace. I saw a dream, and it made me fearful. And these fantasies as I lay in my bed and the visions in my mind kept alarming me. So I gave orders to bring into my presence all the wise men of Babylon, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. Then the magicians, the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and diviners came in, and I related the dream to them, but they could not make its interpretation known to me. But finally, Daniel came in before me, whose name is Belshazzar, according to the name of my God, and in whom is a spirit of the holy gods. And I related the dream to him, saying, O Belshazzar, chief of the magicians, since I know that a spirit of the holy gods is in you, and no mystery baffles you, tell me the visions of my dream, which I have seen, along with its interpretation.
Okay, so based on that, what was Nebuchadnezzar's story? He goes back to, and what's his story? Where does he start?
This dream.
Yep, he had a dream, and how did he describe himself?
He was content,
And prosperous.
prosperous.
He was content, he was prosperous, everything's right with the world, right? In his mind. Okay, and then, what feelings did he have because of the dream?
He was afraid.
He was terrified.
Okay, he was afraid, terrified, and he was, well, yeah, you've got the funny version, so mine says this, I'm joking.
Alarmed?
Mine says this, so he was afraid and alarmed. He certainly wanted us to get the picture of what's going on inside of him, okay? And it was based on what made him afraid, what alarmed him. The dream did. Okay. Now, he called who to interpret his dream? You'd think he'd learn, right? But who does he call?
All the way.
It's like everybody
All
else.
the wise guys. Yep. All the wise guys, and it's the same wise guys that showed up in chapter 3 and couldn't help him. But they come in again. And they can't help him. I want to tell you, and we'll get into this a little bit later on in the lesson, this has probably been close to 30 years since chapter 3. And there's a good reason to see that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But if you keep in mind that Daniel and the nobles' children went into captivity in 605 BC. Then in 597 BC, he went to Jerusalem. He took about 10,000 people and Ezekiel into Babylon. And then in 586, he destroyed Jerusalem. So it's after those events, and it's probably been 30 years approximately, and we'll get into it in just a minute, since Daniel chapter 3. Okay? Why do you think Daniel waited for the wise guys to go first, and then he came later?
So he has his full attention.
Okay, could be.
Nothing to distract Nebuchadnezzar.
Okay, it could be. So he had his full attention. Just saying we don't know.
Right.
But that's it. I was just curious of what you guys thought about why he didn't go right away with everybody else.
I think it's because he wanted to show him that not anyone else could tell him what it meant.
Okay, it could be that too. Yeah, John.
The way he relates this here, if you go back to verse 7, he says, I related the dream to them.
Mm-hmm.
But the first interpretation when this incident actually occurred, he didn't relate it to
In
him.
chapter 3, you mean?
Yeah,
Yeah, he did not.
yeah, so he's a little off here.
Yeah.
The way he's relating this is that he told the Chaldeans and all those guys what the dream was, and they couldn't even interpret it. But the way he's coming across here is that he didn't tell Daniel what the dream was, but Daniel was able to relate the dream and interpret it.
Well,
Isn't it?
Maybe a
am I
translation
reading
thing,
it?
because I
Yeah,
think it's been 30 years,
Yeah.
it's a little.
But
I mean, he kinda got things off a little
It's
bit.
a little fuzzy.
He's a
Finally,
typical
Daniel
politician.
came into and I told him the
He
dream.
interprets the way he wants to.
Yeah,
Told him
so-
both his others are
yeah,
not.
you're exactly right. So, John, this is for last week where you got me. Okay, here we go. At the end of verse 8, it says, I related the dream to him.
Yeah, okay.
But you got me last week, so we're even.
But yeah, at the first instance of the dream, he wouldn't tell anybody what the dream was.
Right.
And he said he'd kill anybody that couldn't tell him
Yeah,
what the
in
dream was.
chapter
too.
3.
And everybody was like, we can't do that.
Yeah.
But then
And then
he's
Daniel came in and
relating
did
it differently.
Yeah, he's like, well, I told them, and then they couldn't interpret it for
I
him.
think that's what it was. Let me give you a bone here because I want to
Yeah.
know the answer.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you look at what was his description, we don't know why maybe Daniel was just being patient. Okay, go through your charade, and I'm just gonna wait. I mean, or we don't know if he was doing something. you know, we just have no idea, yeah.
It did pretty consistently seem like Daniel was never really eager to do this.
Yep,
It wasn't like, oh, I gotta go tell him I know the answer.
Yep.
It was kind of a
waiting,
obligation, kind of, well, ultimately it happened.
and yet, and maybe God was having to hold back too, we just don't know.
Yeah, I mean, if you're the only person that, like, if he hadn't told what the dream was, and you're the only person who knows what the dream was, other than Nebuchadnezzar, you wouldn't wanna be the first person to go, I know what it was.
Yeah, and he wasn't.
Cause then
that's-
everybody else can give their interpretation.
Yeah, yeah, it could be any of those things, we just don't know. But what we do know is how does he describe Daniel when he sees him?
Calls him the chief of the magicians.
He's the chief of, so he's in charge of all these wise guys, okay?
Go that last.
Yeah.
You're waiting on him.
Yeah, last, okay, he was waiting on him, he had expectations of him, and then how did he describe him?
Spirit of the holy gods. Was in you.
It's kind of all over the place.
So most likely, a good chunk of time has passed, that he's describing him the same way in chapter 1, and here in chapter 4, in chapter 2. And if you think about working for somebody who, you know, he's consistent in his service, in his attitude, and in his behavior. Okay, so let's turn, okay, let's turn to Daniel 4. Let's read 10 through 18. I think we finally get to the tree, Ed.
Okay.
Okay? Let's read 10 through 18. What was the dream?
While I was lying in my bed, this is what I dreamed. I saw a large tree in the middle of the earth. The tree grew very tall and strong, reaching high into the heavens for all the world to see. It had fresh green leaves, and it was loaded with fruit for all to eat. Wild animals lived in its shade, and birds nested in its branches. All the world was fed from this tree. Then as I lay there dreaming, I saw a messenger, a holy one, coming down from heaven. The messenger shouted, "Cut down the tree and lop off its branches, shake off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Chase the wild animals from its shade and the birds from its branches. But leave the stump and the roots in the ground, bound with a band of iron and bronze surrounded by tender grass. Now let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the wild animals among the plants of the field. For 7 periods of time, let him have the mind of a wild animal instead of the mind of a human. For this has been decreed by the messengers, it is commanded by the holy ones, so that everyone may know that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of the world. He gives them to anyone he chooses, even the lowliest of people. Belteshazzar, that was the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, had. Now tell me what it means, for none of the wise men in my kingdom can do so. But you can tell me, because the spirit of the holy gods is in you."
Okay, so there is a transition in there. What is that unique transition in those verses?
Is it that we go from talking about the tree to talking about him?
That is it. Okay, so he's talking about a tree, and what verse is that? That he actually transitions to him is the tree.
15.
Okay, okay. And what will be his fate? What happened to the tree?
Cut down,
Yeah.
scattered, I guess would be.
Okay, it was chopped down. But what's interesting about that, after the tree was chopped down, what's interesting about it?
The roots and the stump was left.
Yep, leave the stump and the roots. So what does that tell you about that tree?
But it can do that.
Yeah, it's still alive,
There's still hope.
okay? And then what's the other thing that he says to do to the stump?
Band it up with iron and bronze or whatever.
Okay, and what that literally means is put a fence around it.
Yeah, I would've never got that.
Seems like a lot of work.
I did too, right?
I was thinking
I was thinking like iron.
Yep, yeah, that's the picture I had too, but it literally means to put a fence around it. Okay, and then we get a time period. What's the time period?
7 years.
Yep. 7 periods of time.
Is that outlined as years or?
That's a good question. And it is, but we can see that periods of time is used in another chapter in this book, and it's meant years there. And so if we would go look at that, I think we'd be confusing the issue to go look at that tonight. But when we hit chapter 7, when he talks about periods of time, I'll try to remember to come back and point that out, that that's how time was talked about in the context of, but it's in chapter 7. And it is years. Okay? So 7 years, and what's the purpose?
To humble him.
And what specifically?
Whose heart or mind will be changed from the heart of a man to the heart of a beast.
Okay, so we're gonna see that, humble him, and then we're gonna, man to a beast. And what are some of those descriptions about the beast?
We're talking about being drenched with the dew of heaven and live with them and even the planets, not the planets, the
Yep.
planets.
Okay, yep. Alright, so that's what we're seeing there, but as far as humbling him, he had to be humbled and recognize what?
Who was in charge?
Yes. God was in charge. Okay, so if you go, if there's been about 30 years from chapter 3, and let's go back to chapter 3, I don't know where I put that in this lesson, but if I did, we're going back to chapter 3, and I want us to read at the end of verse 15. And what did he say to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? We don't want to read all those instruments. The band is playing, and then what does he say?
Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand.
What God will be able to rescue you from my hand?
With a capital G.
Yeah. And this is the lesson, this is the chapter, this is the life experience when that God takes him on. And that's why it's when he recognizes who God is. How does Daniel respond in chapter 4, verse 19? We didn't read that, so would somebody read 19? Let's see what Daniel has to say.
Then Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, was greatly perplexed for a time, and his thoughts terrified him. So the king said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream of it or its meaning alarm you. Belteshazzar answered, my lord, if only the dream applied to your enemies and its meaning to your adversaries.
So how did Daniel respond to understanding the dream?
He was alarmed.
He was alarmed as well. And what did he do? So he was alarmed. What did he do before he did something?
He hesitated.
He hesitated, or he thought for a while, or some kind of sense of, not only was he alarmed, he had to think before he spoke. Do you think he was afraid to speak up?
Well, you don't want to piss off Nebuchadnezzar.
Right, well, exactly. But it doesn't seem to be an issue. Yes. But it doesn't seem
He
to.
already threw some people in the fire.
Right.
It's not
But do you think he's afraid of him? Do you think that's what made him think?
I think he was he has compassion for him, actually.
And yet he has served in this man's court for his entire life, adult life, and he knows what kind of guy he is. And yet when this is going to come on him, he's alarmed and he's thoughtful before he speaks. And I do think he does care about it.
The Bible says he wondered how to break the news.
Okay? Okay? And I think it's really, again, the Spirit of God in Daniel, in his circumstances, it'd be so easy to respond, oh, now you're going to get yours. you took me from my home that long ago, or you took me from my family, but that's not who he was, and it's not how he lived.
But also, he probably, since he's such a, or at least was a high-ranking official in the government, he saw that dream and said, okay, the king is gonna be out of commission for 7 years. In 7 years, what can happen to a kingdom if the king isn't there? So that's really difficult to deal with.
That
So
is,
like Nebuchadnezzar was the ruler of the kingdom and he kept the kingdom, people from doing wrong, but if somebody started stepping into his place,
yeah, that is a good
Why?
point. We're gonna get into that, Dan, in just a minute. And in fact, it's important to point out that he's at ease in his castle because he is the ruler of the known world. He's in charge. He's large and in charge. And so that's why he's at ease in his castle. Okay, so let's read Daniel 4:20 through 22, and let's see what we find out from Daniel.
the tree that you saw which grew and became strong, whose height reached to the heavens and which could be seen by all the earth, whose leaves were lovely and its fruit was abundant, in which was food for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and in whose branches the birds of the heaven had their home. It is you, O King, who have grown and become strong, for your greatness has grown and reaches to the heavens, and your dominion to the end of the earth.
Okay, so, oh, I'm sorry.
Do you want to go to 22, right?
Yes, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Or do you want to go to 24?
No, just through 22.
That was 22.
Yeah, okay. All right, so the tree, the growth of the tree represented what?
The growth of
The kingdom and his power.
Yes, the growth of his kingdom and his power while he was king. And he conquered everyone in the known world, okay? And then we're also told, Daniel tells him, the tree is
You.
you, okay?
I
Let's
think,
re-
I
yeah.
think it bears mentioning that these words, that he had become great and that his kingdom had reached the sky and he had dominion to the ends of the earth. This was from God. That vision that he had where that was spoken was from God.
It is, thank you. Okay. All right, let's read 23 through 25.
Inasmuch the king saw a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven and saying, chop down the tree and destroy it, but leave its stump and roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze in the tender grass of the field. Let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let him graze with the beasts of the field till 7 times pass over him. This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king. Say 25 too.
Mm-hmm.
They shall drive you from men, your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make you eat grass like oxen. They shall wet you with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over you, till you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and gives it to whomever he chooses.
Okay, so we're getting a few more details that are about the beast here, or about him becoming like an animal. What are some additional details that were given here?
Gonna eat grass.
Eat grass,
Put out the pasture.
He'll be driven away, yeah.
okay, driven away, which is interesting too when, like you said, about what happens to a kingdom. Because we know all of this is gonna take how long?
7 years.
Something.
7 years, yep. Gonna take 7 years, and so, is there any other details that were given there?
He'll sleep out in the fields with the animals,
Okay,
because he gets the dew on him.
okay, what else? His nails,
They're like claws.
kinda like claws, okay?
And this is gonna go on, it says, until you recognize the
Yep.
Most High.
So think about, he doesn't recognize about 30 years into this deal, And it's gonna take him 7 years of living like a beast to come to that point. Okay? Alright, so what is it showing how deep something is seated in his life?
Pride.
Is so rooted in his life, okay? So let's read 26 and 27.
And as it was commanded to leave the stump of the roots of the tree, the kingdom shall be confirmed for you from the time that you know that heaven rules. Therefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by practicing righteousness, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, that there may perhaps be a lengthening of your prosperity.
Okay, so what does he tell him to do? There's another move left on the board. What does he tell him to do?
Stop sinning.
Okay,
Last ditch effort.
Okay.
yep, stop sinning. Do,
Accept my advice. But
okay, yeah, he is saying, accept my
Yeah.
advice. Here, I'm trying to help you here.
Do what's right.
Being kind. Be
Okay.
oppressed.
Now, that's, okay, and there's one thing, I wanna do that one last. There's one other thing in here.
Break from your wicked past.
Or do righteousness is what mine says. So, stop sinning, do righteousness, or live righteously. And then, is righteousness? Yeah. And then be kind to the poor. Why in heaven's name does he throw that one in? Why does he specifically say be kind to the poor?
Evidently, you hadn't been.
Maybe gave him no mind at all.
Okay, and he is incredibly wealthy, right?
If he's so wealthy, there shouldn't be too many poor people in his kingdom.
But there are, and it's pointed out specifically. Why, what is it about him that would be pointed out? He's got a lot of resources, unlimited resources.
Greed.
Greed, yeah.
This is about me. He didn't give anyone else in his kingdom a real thought. And it's interesting because it shows that even though he had everything, how selfish he was. It just made him more selfish. Greed. Okay. We're also told in there what's going to happen to his kingdom.
It's also a remarkable, I mean, it's just such a remarkable example of stubbornness.
Oh yeah,
And
for
like
sure.
a reflection of humanity, of kind of all these examples and reminders, and then you get to this point and you're told that you have something that you can do about it, not gonna do that. Then you're told how long you're gonna have to suffer before you'll figure it out ahead of time.
Right, right.
And it still takes you that long to figure it out.
Right,
Like, I think
right.
as soon as that happened to me, you would like to think,
Right.
right? You've been told it's gonna take you 7 years. No, I got it. I got the message.
Yeah. I'm not going to do those
Yeah.
7
Still
years.
gonna take, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm guessing by the time you start becoming a beast at that point, like, God's not gonna, he's not gonna be like, okay, I'll let you have
Right?
You're gonna be
Well,
like,
but that's what I'm saying.
you're like,
That's
that's
the
told you 7 years.
That's the amazing nature
Yeah.
of God and the amazing stubbornness of us. Like, God
Yes.
knows that's what it's gonna be, so He can
Yes.
tell you that story. And our amazing stubbornness is, I mean, it's all the way back to Adam and Eve,
It
right?
is.
I told you what was gonna happen, you did it anyway.
Yes.
And
Very good. That's right. And it also shows not only his stubbornness, but what does it show about God? His
stubborn-
patience?
I was like, his stubborn.
Yeah, his stubbornness.
Follow through?
Yeah. Okay. His patience, he's pursuing Nebuchadnezzar. He is so much pursuing Nebuchadnezzar, even through that. It really shows his grace.
Even though he's a Gentile,
Yep, it really shows his grace. And how many times do we hear people say in the Old Testament that God is kind of mean, and that there's not much grace in the Old Testament. And this is one of the great examples of that's not true. It's not true. Okay, so what's going to happen to his kingdom at the end of those 7 years?
You know, back.
He's going to have it back. And what else? Does it say about his kingdom.
It's gonna be intact.
Yeah, and he's promising him this. This is crazy to a guy that's been lived his whole life this way, and then he's showing him, he's taking him on, which is uncomfortable grace for him, but he's taking him on, and he's going to give it back his kingdom. And so that's what we know about that fence around the stump, and why the stump, and why it was kept alive. Okay, now how unusual is that during those times? The king is eating grass in the field. How unusual would that be for his kingdom to be restored?
It would probably be very, very rare.
Very.
If your king goes off the rails, that the next king doesn't step up, you know what I mean?
Yep.
Or the next conquering country doesn't come in and obliterate him.
You know,
By
all
God's
the
grace,
other
Just they don't
ones.
start, revolting
Yeah,
and just
exactly.
tearing away.
Yep, even the kingdom, but
Yeah.
let alone somebody else that wants that throne, which people were always vying for the throne.
Well, I think by God doing that, He's showing him, like, I'm not doing it to take your kingdom away. I'm not doing it to, remove you from the kingdom. I'm doing it to show you that I could if I wanted to.
That's absolutely the truth. And I can take it from you,
Right.
and because it's mine,
I'll give it to you and I can take
I
it
can
back.
give it back to you. It's amazing. It is amazing. So what two choices did Nebuchadnezzar have?
Change his ways
Change his ways.
and become a beast.
Change his ways?
Be righteous. I mean, Daniel tells him things to do.
Yep.
And he doesn't, or he could be a beast.
Okay.
Like turned into
For 7 years.
for 7 years.
Yep. So it's either humble himself,
Or God,
choose,
or God will humble
or
him.
God will humble. Those are the two choices that lay before him. Okay, so let's read 28 through 30. And we can, and then 33 and 34.
And this happened to Nebuchadnezzar, the king. 12 months later, he was walking
Okay,
on.
sorry. So he gets all that, and then how much more time does he get?
A whole year.
A whole year. Okay, go ahead.
He was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, and the king reflected and said, "Is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself have built as a royal residence by the might of my power and for the glory of my majesty?"
Okay, while those words were being said,
And then I'll drop down.
yeah, drop down to 33 and 34.
Immediately the word concerning Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled, and he was driven away from mankind and began eating grass like the cattle, and his body was drenched with dew of heaven until his hair had grown like eagle's feathers and his nails like bird's claws. And at the end of that period, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation.
Okay, so just so you know, when he's looking on the palace and he's looking over his place, 1.2 million people live in the city of Babylon. And it's surrounded by a moat, and it's surrounded by a high wall, and that wall is 87 feet high, and it is, 300 feet high and 87 feet wide. They used to have chariot races on the top of that wall. And so that's what he's looking at. The Euphrates River ran through it, so that meant they had what?
Water.
They had fresh water. They had 20 years stored of food. And so he's looking over this, but that's not even enough. So one of his wives he married, she got homesick, so he built a mountain, 400-foot high mountain, and he put the hanging gardens there, and so she could go there, and it actually had, because of the water flowing over the mountain, had like air conditioning. Not bad in that, that time. So he's looking at all of that stuff, and there's one of the 7 wonders of the world that he did, and that's what he's talking about when he says, look at this town that I made. Okay, so what happened to him?
everything God said.
Yep, and how long?
7 years.
Yep. Okay, so, because of two things, people will look at this chapter and go, I'm not so sure that's right. What are these you think might be the two things? Have you ever seen a man on
Turned
all
into a-
fours in a field? What?
I said that like it actually turned into a beast.
Yeah. So there is. I'm writing it because I don't know how to say it.
Oh, I saw that today, yeah,
Oh, entropy.
yeah, it's when like you think you're like a large
Yep.
animal, like,
Yep, this is exactly a bovine.
yeah.
You think you're a large beast, okay? Like
I said an ox.
Hemithropy is kind of, that's another, this is the werewolf thing. And then the other one is like and that's,
Zoanthropy,
yeah,
just any,
you
just
got
like
it.
you were an animal.
You
or
got it.
something.
And they're listed, these diseases are listed in pharmaceutical guides. There's also a guy in 1946 that went, it's rare, obviously, it's very rare, but there's a guy that went to a sane asylum in England in 1946. He's a reporter and he saw this guy and he was living out on the grass and that's all he did was eat grass. And he lived on the grounds and he lived outside and he would pick through the grass and not eat all of it. And he actually did have thicker fingernails and that's how he functioned. It's a rare case. And so that's one of the things that people are talking about it more in our time than through the years. But it does happen and sometimes it's an enzyme thing. Anyway, it does happen. There's reported cases of them. They're obviously very rare. The other issue that people will struggle with this book, what do you think it is?
I just gotta say, I was at a YMCA coaches meeting last night, and there was a parent that was telling about their previous experience coaching. It was really funny. Just tying it to this, they said, I had a kid one time, I never knew if they were a cow or a kid. Literally, they would move, and
Really?
they would eat grass
Oh
on the
my
field.
gosh.
Anyway, just so
Yeah,
funny that
that's
it happened
funny.
yesterday.
That is
I had
funny.
to tell that.
Yeah,
I mean, there
I
are,
couldn't hold out.
I got you.
Well, in this quiet moment.
I mean, there are like food eating disorders like pikas that they have to like eat clay or they have to eat wood
That's
chips
true.
and stuff like that too.
Yep.
So
That is true.
he might have been, he got struck with this by God, of course, but I mean, it actually happens.
Right.
I
But the
picture it
other-
more like he was hypnotized. Cause it happened so fast and got out of it so fast, it's like God hypnotized him.
Well, and
I
I think I really think there was some disease that came upon some of it. They're saying syphilis that was maybe attributed to that. So there's a lot of possibilities, but there are cases. It's obviously very rare. And I actually jumped ahead of myself. I'm going to go ahead. So I'm going to go to the question. I'm going to go back. Okay. But after his reasoning returned to him, what was true of his kingdom? What was going to happen?
It was restored.
It was going to be restored. And also, I want to point out, it's very interesting for an arrogant man from 682 to 575 BC, there's not a word recorded from Nebuchadnezzar. And that's one of the reasons why they think so much time has passed from chapter 3 to chapter 4 is like he's bragging on himself all the time. And they had the Babylonian Chronicles, and for that time period, nothing was written from him for 7 years. It's very possible Daniel being in his court was part of preserving his life. We really don't know, we're not told, but it is a possibility. Okay, so I want you to go back before we finish this.
So you,
Go ahead.
before I rudely interrupt
No, you
my
didn't.
story, you had asked the question though, what is the other question that people have about this book? Was that your answer, or was there something
That
more?
is,
Okay.
so it's the disease, and is that really a real disease? Does that really happen to people? So that would be the first one, and the second one was, how did he keep his kingdom? How did he keep his kingdom for 7 years? And is there any evidence to support the fact that he was AWOL, quote, quote, for 7 years? And that is a piece of evidence that he didn't speak.
So are theologians the ones that are bringing this question up? Or
No, since the late 1800s, there's higher criticism that came into, instead of reading the Bible, let's shoot the Bible apart. And so we're going to see more and more as we go through the prophecy part of this book. We're going to see why people cannot accept, unless they believe God wrote it, and that God can tell what's going to happen ahead of time. So they want to change the date to about 165 BC, and you'll understand why as we go through this book. But there's a lot
Well,
of
and this is-
criticism. Go ahead.
All I would say is, sorry to interrupt that.
No, you're good.
You know, it's Nebuchadnezzar that's actually writing all of this. So it's his experience.
Right,
He could have been, I mean, God could have put him into a coma and he dreamt all of that
right,
as well.
right.
Because that's, I mean, there's no, you know, Babylonian records about him being like, oh, he got trained, he's a beast in the field for.
Right,
7
there are
years.
none. That is a
We're
true
like, no, he
statement.
went to sleep.
Yeah.
And didn't wake up for 7 years.
But I mean, that's where we have this chapter in Daniel to fill in those gaps. Okay?
I mean, I guess if he's the king and he's got everything running so smoothly, all, you know, would he need to have outside contact outside of his, where he is? I mean,
There's
But-
so much, and we're going to see even as we go through this book. Man, these guys didn't survive very long in their kingdom, let alone if you're not, you know,
if you're not there.
if you're not
defending
there. Exactly. Okay, so I want us to jump back up. I want us to read Proverbs 8:13.
The fear of the Lord is to hate evil, pride and arrogance and the evil way and the perverted mouth I hate.
Okay, so why does God say he hates pride and arrogance? Why does God hate pride and arrogance?
Because he's a jealous God, and when you're pride and arrogant, that's putting yourself on his level.
Okay? Any other thoughts? Why does God hate pride and arrogance?
It's self-serving.
Self-serving. Anybody else?
I think it probably leads to evil behavior.
So he equates it to evil. I
Yeah.
agree. Right before that, he says,
And the more evil you have, the less love you have for God.
Okay. And as we look at Nebuchadnezzar, do we see that that is what drives him? Would you say that that's what drives him?
Yeah, I mean, he says,
Yeah.
my glory, my,
Yep. It's a driving
he says,
motivation.
my glory and my majesty.
Okay. What did Nebuchadnezzar think that he controlled?
the world.
Everything.
The world.
And we live, like he lived, under the illusion that what?
We have control.
That we have control of anything. So it's an illusion. Pride, and also it deceives. Right? Does pride not deceive? Do we not see that in his life? Okay, let's read Proverbs 16:18. What does Proverbs 16:18 say?
Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall.
is that exactly the description that we're seeing of what happened to Nebuchadnezzar? I feel your pain, man.
Right.
So before it leads to a fall. And in his case, and often, even though we may not see it, what is true of that fall?
It wasn't as sudden as he felt it.
Okay?
He felt he was above God, so he didn't see that he was, so, you know, like when Daniel warned him, that was like a little stumble. You're falling a little bit.
Right? Okay. What else is true of that fall?
Could be God ordained.
It was God ordained. He was going to teach him something about himself and about God.
But do we see that in our own lives? Do we recognize that as such?
And I'm going to contend too that part of that fall is grace.
It could also have been avoided.
It could have been avoided. Had he humbled himself, or God humbled him. Those were his choices. Let's read Isaiah 53:6.
All of us like sheep have strayed away. We have left God's path to follow our own. Yet the Lord laid on him the sins of us all.
What is Isaiah telling us?
Everyone has strayed. Everyone has strayed.
Yeah, everyone is straight, and each one has gone to his own way. And what leads each one to go their own way?
Right.
Pride. And it's what sent Jesus to the cross. Okay, let's go back and let's go to Daniel chapter 4, and let's read the rest of what we have. Let's read the rest through 37, I think is the last verse. Yep. So 34 through 37. I think you read 34, Elaine.
But at the end of that period, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes towards heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever, for his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. And all the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, but he does according to his will in the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. And no one can ward off his hand, or say to him, what hast thou done? At that time my reason returned to me, and my majesty and splendor were restored to me for the glory of my kingdom. And my counselors and my nobles began seeking me out, so I was reestablished in my sovereignty, and surpassing greatness was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven, and all his works are true, and his ways are just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride.
Okay, after his kingdom was restored to him, what happened? In verse 36, what do we see?
It was even greater than before.
It's
Better
greater than
ever.
before, okay? And what else do we see?
All his counselors and nobles began seeking him.
Okay, it's interesting that he notes that, and if we take into consideration there's a period of time of silence, and that God did a miracle to preserve his kingdom for him and to restore him as a different, humbled man. Okay,
So why is that?
go ahead.
I'm just trying to think through why that's notable. Like his advisors and nobles sought me out. Is that commentary around like advancement of wisdom in him, or is it? I'm just wondering why that's notable.
I think that part of it, and I don't know for sure, but I think part of it is that, and they potentially could have seen where he came from. And so that, and they could have.
Yeah, it's like, how did you ascend back here? Or how
Yes.
did you, maybe that drew their curiosity. I don't know, I'm just curious. It's kind of an interesting little added.
It
Maybe
is.
it was 7 years to the day since he had been driven from the town too.
Yeah.
So they
And-
were like, hey, it's been 7 years. Go look for him.
Yeah. And also we see he's a changed man, right? He is a different guy. Are they seeking him out because they recognize he is a different man?
It also shows that they're accepting what happened and that he's back and that they're good
Yep.
with it.
And it shows that God fulfilled his word
Right.
just like he said he would. Why is that important for us to know that?
God's not bluffing on anything,
Right.
and,
He's faithful.
yeah.
And what good did he bring to this man through a really difficult situation? It's amazing his love for Nebuchadnezzar, really. Okay, there's a phrase in there that kind of takes me back to chapter 3. Can anybody come up with it? Back to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Our God is, and what's something that Nebuchadnezzar says?
They said our God is able to deliver us.
Okay, what does Nebuchadnezzar say?
He is able to humble those who walk in pride.
And that became part of his story. Because he was a man who was humbled and he walked in pride, and God was able to humble him. Turn with me to 1 Peter 5, and we're going to end here. I just want to read 5 and 6 and 7. Wait, 5 and 6? 5 and 6. 1 Peter 5, 5 and 6. And while you're looking for that, how would you describe the culture that we live in now?
Everybody's Nebuchadnezzar.
Okay.
Right.
On steroids.
Everyone was Jonah a couple of Sundays ago.
Yep.
What did you say?
Everybody was Jonah.
Nebuchadnezzar.
Okay, gotcha.
That, I mean, that, you know, that's
Yes.
just what it said. And at lunch, I told everyone, okay, we're all Jonahs.
Right? But we live in a culture that pride is so promoted. Humility is like looked down on. And that's the environment. And it's worse, right? All of us that are older, maybe when you're younger, you notice it as well. But it's really pervades our culture. Okay? Let's read 1 Peter 5, 5 and 6.
In the same way, you who are younger, submit yourselves to your elders.
See, that's why I read that. We can go home now.
All of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another, because God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the
Humble.
Humble yourselves therefore under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time.
Okay, so a couple of questions. What's God reinforcing in a Christian's life against the backdrop of our culture?
To have humility.
To have humility. Okay, and what two situations does he bring out in those verses?
Pridefulness
identifies-
and humility.
Say what?
Pridefulness and humility.
He does talk about pridefulness and humility, but he specifically is talking about it regarding basically two.
Oh, to one another.
Submit yourselves to your elders.
That was the one I was talking about again. Thank you. No, I wasn't, but thank you. I'll pay you for that. Okay, there's two he's referring to, two groups besides elders.
God opposes the proud.
He does oppose the proud, but he's saying, look at where we're told to be humble.
Clothe yourselves with humility toward one another,
One another.
and humble yourselves, under God's mighty hand.
Okay,
that He
and
may
God.
lift you up.
So that's what God is telling us as Christians, and against the backdrop of our culture, this is completely different. Why does he tell us to humble ourselves with one another?
Because that's how you get grace. He says that in that verse. But God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble.
We want to experience grace.
You can't experience grace unless you humble yourself.
Yep. That's one thing he specifically says. And so will you say
I
something?
was gonna say, I went to this leadership thing last week, and one of the things Mark Patterson said was, everyone is superior to you in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was a really good, impactful thing that applies here, right?
Yeah, it
About
does.
humbling yourself, acknowledging that
Yes.
everybody has some superiority over you.
And to be okay with that.
Yes, yes.
This Sewell leadership event
Oh,
last week,
yeah.
Okay? And to be okay with
It's
that.
really good.
It's okay that somebody can do something better than I can. And if I'm okay with that, then I might be able to say to Elaine, you do that better than I do. And also another reason that we humble, so God is clearly saying that pride does what? Do the opposite. Tells us to be humble with one another, be humble with God. But if we flip it, if we're prideful, what do we see?
A fall from God.
A fall from God for sure.
Arrogant. Arrogant.
It's gonna impact these two things, guaranteed.
It'll impact your relationship with other people.
Exactly, and with God. And pride is gonna be the root of the problem. Why does he say humble ourselves with each other?
So we can learn from each other
We can learn from each other. Yes, that's good. Why else?
and lean on each other too.
Okay.
This
He
is-
has to tell us that because it's not a natural thing.
All of this is not natural. That's exactly right, Ed.
But it all goes back to love God, love people.
It does. It does. And we're not gonna get this message anywhere else but from the Bible. Our culture is gonna tell us something different. And it's gonna hurt our relationships with people and with God. And another reason we have to humble ourselves with each other is because if you have pride with me, you're gonna stir up my pride in me, and we're just gonna start going this way, right? How many times does that happen? We stir up pride in one another. And so that's why we're encouraged to be humble. Not encouraged, we're told to. Because as Ed just said, this is not normal for us. That's why God has to tell us. This is what real life looks like. This is what you can be. Okay, anything else as far as, or what do we need to live in humility? We're gonna take these two verses in 1 Peter 5. What do we need to live in humility?
Trusting God.
Trusting God. If we're up against the backdrop of a culture, we're coming out of a culture that says pride, pride, pride. What are we gonna need to be able to live our lives? We are gonna need God, and God to change what?
Humility.
Yes, we are gonna need humility and learn to live in humility. And God has to change what?
Our hearts.
Our hearts and our minds to value the attitude of humility and the power of that in relationship.
We see that so much in our society today because of the pride and the selfishness, and we're so turned in that there's no respect anywhere for authority
It's getting worse and
of
worse.
any kind.
Yep, it's really
It's all
true.
about me.
It is really true. And it's
And we're breeding that in
energized
little kids.
Yes, it's true. Okay, so, and God wants us to have that attitude of humility and the attitude of service toward other people. And that's, without an attitude of humility, service will never really come. C.S. Lewis said humility is not thinking less of ourselves, but thinking of ourselves less. So, and he also tells us what we're to do with humility. Very important in verse 5. What is he, after the elder part, Misty? What are we supposed to do with humility?
Clothe yourselves.
Clothe yourself. What does that tell you? Okay.
It's like
Live
an
it.
air, like of like a.
Yeah, like
Almost
live
like-
in humility.
Yeah, yeah, it's like,
Be-
we're all dressed here tonight,
Yeah.
thankfully,
Put
right?
clothes on.
Yeah.
Exactly. So think of humility as like when, it's like wearing clothes. It is so much supposed to be a part of who we are, because so much comes out of pride and so much comes out of humility. What do the humble discover? I think you said one for sure. John, what did you say? That the humble discover?
Grace.
Grace.
Yes, that's the only way you can achieve grace, but also at the end of verse 6, it tells us what the result of humbling ourselves are, is if you do it under the mighty hand of God, then He will exalt you at the proper time. You will have wonderful consequences from that, wonderful rewards.
And by humble yourselves in the mighty hand of God, what is a person doing that does that? Absolutely. God, you got this. God, you know what you're doing.
God's in control.
You're in charge. That's really exactly what that statement is. Okay, and that He's working on His will according to His plan. And that's what we're continuing to see and will continue to see in Daniel. Why does God oppose the proud?
Because it puts them above or.
Separates them from God.
It really does. And isn't that what God was after with Nebuchadnezzar?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, He wanted him to see that he was God, but why didn't He just let him do his own thing? Because He wanted relationship with Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, last question. I have, what do believers have to be proud of? Jesus. And along that line, how many times do we forget anything that we have is from God? And how many times has someone tripped over a Christian's pride in trying to find God?
And Christian and pride are kind of antithesis.
But do
Yeah.
Christians show pride?
All the
Do
time.
all the time.
All the time.
And that's what it should be, John. What you said should be true. But unfortunately, so often we forget what God has blessed us with and given us, and somebody is tripping over our pride while they're trying to find God.
You know, when he was up there on the, looking over up on the city, I was like, look at my kingdom that I built. If you would just finish that sentence with, because God gave me the ability to do it.
Right? It would have been a shorter chapter.
Yeah.
Probably wouldn't have been a chapter.
Right?
But I think it's okay for us to be proud of our accomplishments as long as we recognize that we did it through God and it's only through Him that.
I think, Chelsea, what God wants us to do is enjoy the things that He gives us. I think He wants us to enjoy
Yeah,
those things.
as long as we do it for Him and recognize that it's Him.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I kind of wonder how many people in that kingdom were turned towards God because of what Nebuchadnezzar.
Well, God was working His magic while He was sitting His 7 years, you know, so.
You do, and that we're not gonna know. We're not gonna know, but we find this changed man who every second was saying, I'm gonna kill you, I'm gonna kill you. And then all of a sudden people are seeking him out, and people, I think, are noticing the change in him, and we don't know. But it's amazing, and along those lines, it's amazing even in our hearts what God can do through someone who knows He's God.
Yeah, I mean, he takes you
Recognizes
from a
it.
guy that I can kill you,
Yeah.
till he's out there eating grass in
Right.
the field. I mean, from there to there and then
Right.
back up to there.
Right. And it shows, you know, and it really does show what influence do we have? We all have our own worlds. What influence and how do we conduct ourselves in those worlds?
I almost see Nebuchadnezzar as Paul, because he chose Nebuchadnezzar as his servant way ahead of time, a long time ago, before he even arose to power. And he chose to humble him and make him his servant.
Yep.
To serve him.
Yep.
And only him.
Yep.
And Paul was kind of done the same thing.
Yep.
The same way.
Nebuchadnezzar is off the stage in history at this point in the book of Daniel going forward. And so what a great way to walk out of being a proud man to a humble man to someone that God could use. All right, would anybody like to close?
Sure, I'll pray.
Thank you.
Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this day. We thank you for this message and this reminder not to be prideful in ourselves, Lord, but to be grateful for your mercy and grace toward us. Lord, we just ask that you help us put that to practice and find ways to show our humility each day, and just to carry that and wear it just like you instructed us. Thank you, Father, for all our many blessings. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. It's good to see all of you guys. Next week you get a break. But lest we forget about pride, there is chapter 5. Okay.